I'll never forget the feeling of someone watching me, even when I was alone. I'm not the type of person who scares easily. I've been a detective for over a decade, seen some dark things, and been through situations that would send most people running. But nothing in my career prepared me for the case I took on that autumn. It started with an odd call. A young woman, maybe in her mid-20s, was found dead in a local park. It wasn't the usual kind of case you'd expect me to work on. No obvious crime scene, no forced entry, nothing stolen. Just a body, lying there in broad daylight, completely lifeless. The first thing I noticed was that no one had seen anything. A few joggers passed by the area in the early morning, but none of them remembered hearing anything strange. No screams, no cries for help, just silence. It's strange when you're a detective, how often people can miss the obvious. And this case, the more I looked into it, the stranger it became. The body was found near the old cemetery on the outskirts of town, close to a place where I used to go as a kid. The area was known for being quiet, eerie even, especially after sunset. But that didn't matter. I had work to do. The victim was identified as Emma Parker, a local college student. She didn't have any enemies, and as far as anyone knew, she led a normal life. There was no history of mental illness, no signs of trauma, and no obvious reason why someone would want to hurt her. Her parents were devastated, and all they could tell me was that she'd been acting strangely the night before, staring at the walls, pacing, muttering to herself. But that wasn't anything concrete. It was just a worried parent's instinct. I spoke to the people who found her. A couple out walking their dog noticed something off about the body. They said she was lying on her side, eyes open, like she was staring at something just out of view. That's when the weird part happened. The dog, a big Rottweiler, suddenly bolted, dragging the owner into the woods. The couple was so shaken up that they left the scene and didn't think to call anyone until later. That's when I started getting a gut feeling that something wasn't right. There was something off about the whole thing, like I was missing a big piece of the puzzle. But the more I dug, the more I realized that the people in town knew something they weren't telling me, and I couldn't figure out why. I asked around at the local diner, where the town's gossip was always flowing, but people seemed to change the subject whenever I brought up the incident. They would glance away quickly, uncomfortable, as if there was some unspoken rule about not discussing it. I could tell they knew something, but no one would talk. A few days into the investigation, I decided to visit the cemetery near where Emma's body was found. I figured I might learn something from the locals. Perhaps someone had seen something strange. The cemetery was old, surrounded by trees that gave it a dark, almost oppressive feeling. I had heard rumors about it as a kid, how it was haunted or cursed. At the time, I thought it was just stories to scare kids. As I walked through the cemetery, I noticed an old man sitting on a bench, hunched over with his head down. His clothes were worn, but he didn't seem out of place. I approached him, hoping he might know something about the area. "Excuse me, sir," I said, trying to sound friendly. "I'm Detective Ryan. I'm investigating the death of a woman found here recently. You wouldn't happen to know anything, would you?" The old man slowly lifted his head, his eyes barely open. They were clouded, as if he hadn't seen much in years. But when he looked at me, there was something unnerving about his gaze, like he wasn't seeing me at all. "Leave it alone," he said in a raspy voice. This place isn't for you. You're too late." I didn't know what to make of it. I tried to press him, but he wouldn't say anything else, just muttered under his breath, something about shadows and people who disappear. I shook it off, thinking he was just some crazy old man. But then I noticed something strange. He didn't have a shadow. It was a sunny day, and the light was coming from behind him. But when I looked down, there was no shadow at his feet, just an empty space. I stared at it for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Maybe the light was hitting him in a way that made it hard to see his shadow. But the more I thought about it, the more it felt wrong. I asked around town, but no one knew who the man was. They had never seen him before. Some even said there had been rumors of a strange man sitting on that same bench for years. But no one could recall any real details about him. The more I asked, the more the town seemed to close in on itself, as if there was something they didn't want me to know. As the days went by, I started to hear whispers. People around town talked about strange things happening in the area, like people disappearing or being found in odd places with no memory of how they got there. The stories were starting to pile up, all connected to this cemetery. But when I went to the police records, there was nothing. No missing persons reports, no unexplained deaths. It was like they never existed. The strangest part, every time I tried to get closer to the truth, it felt like someone, or something, was pushing me away. My own colleagues started acting strange when I brought up the cemetery. I'd walk into the office and hear whispers, or I'd find people staring at me like I was doing something wrong. It felt like I was the one being watched, like everyone knew more than they were letting on. One afternoon, I visited the town's small library, hoping to find some old records about the cemetery. It wasn't long before the librarian, an older woman named Mrs. Collins, approached me. She was pale and fidgety, and when she saw me, her eyes widened in fear. "You don't want to know," she said quickly, her voice trembling. "Leave it alone. The cemetery, it's not a place for questions. You should stop looking into it." She practically shoved me out of the library, and I was left standing on the front steps, feeling more uneasy than ever. The more I uncovered, the less I wanted to know. It wasn't long before things started to get worse. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to hear faint whispers coming from outside my window. I tried to ignore it at first, thinking it was just the wind or some kids messing around. But then the whispers started calling my name. I didn't tell anyone about it. I knew they wouldn't believe me, and I didn't want to seem crazy. But I started losing sleep, and I became more and more paranoid. Everywhere I went, I felt like I was being followed, like someone, or something, was always behind me. I couldn't escape the feeling. I even started seeing things. People I knew, but they weren't really them. I talked to someone at work, and their eyes would look hollow, like they weren't human. They would smile, but it didn't feel real. The world around me started to blur. I was losing grip on reality, and I knew it, but I couldn't stop. I found myself going back to the cemetery more often, drawn to it against my will. Every time I went there, it felt like something was pulling me in deeper. The air was colder, the shadows longer. The cemetery had become my obsession, even though I knew it was dangerous. I was caught in its grip, and I couldn't escape. The more I visited the cemetery, the more I realized there was something I was missing, something bigger than just Emma's death. Late one evening, while looking for answers, I ended up in the old town archives, a place no one seemed to visit anymore. Dust clung to the air, and the dim light made the shelves of ancient books and papers feel alive. It was there I found a crumbling leather-bound diary tucked beneath a stack of forgotten records. The name on the cover was unfamiliar, but it was dated back to the early days of the town. As I flipped through the pages, a chilling story unfolded. The town had been on the brink of destruction, failed harvests, sickness sweeping through families, and hopelessness consuming everyone. In their desperation, the townsfolk turned to something they didn't understand. The diary described a ritual in the cemetery under a blood moon, where a pact was made with an unseen entity. The deal was simple but horrifying. The town would thrive, but in exchange, every generation, the entity would claim a soul. The diary didn't name the entity, only called it the Watcher, but it described how its presence lingered in the cemetery, waiting for its next offering. The ritual wasn't just a one-time event. The people who had made the pact left behind a hidden system, one passed down in secret. Every generation, when the time came, the whispers would begin in the cemetery, calling the chosen one. The signs were unmistakable: strange dreams, a pull toward the graveyard, and the feeling of being watched. My heart pounded as I read those words. Emma had experienced all of this. She wasn't just unlucky that night. She had been chosen, and no one in the town had stopped it. But the diary didn't stop there. It spoke of those who tried to resist the pact, families who fled the town after realizing their loved ones were marked. But the Watcher always found them. Some were driven mad by the whispers. Others were claimed in terrible, unexplained accidents. There was no escape. As I shut the diary, my hands trembled. Everything about Emma's death finally made sense, but it also left me with a terrifying question. If the pact demanded one soul every generation, and Emma was already gone, who would be next? Me. The next day, I couldn't stay away. The things I'd uncovered about the town kept circling in my mind, refusing to let me rest. The pact, the whispers, the history, all of it pointed to the cemetery, to that strange old man who seemed to know more than anyone else. I needed answers. I needed to confront him. I stormed into the graveyard, shoving the rusty gate open as its hinges let out a tortured groan. The cold wind picked up immediately, swirling dead leaves around my feet, like an unseen force urging me forward. My heart was pounding, not just from anger but from fear. Fear of what I might find. My eyes locked onto the old man standing at the far end of the cemetery, near the oldest, most decayed gravestones. He stood unnervingly still, as though he'd been expecting me, his figure half-shrouded in the mist that had started creeping in. Without hesitation, I sprinted toward him, my feet crunching against the gravel path. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the ground itself wanted to hold me back. Still, I pushed on, my chest heaving with determination. As I closed the distance, he finally turned to face me. The moonlight caught his features, and I froze. His face looked the same, yet somehow not. His eyes, dark and bottomless, seemed to draw me in, while his thin lips curled into a faint, twisted smile. There was an unnatural stillness to him, as if he were more shadow than man. Slowly, he raised a bony hand, his fingers trembling as though channeling some unseen force. The air grew heavy around me, thick and suffocating. A strange hum filled the cemetery, growing louder, vibrating through my chest. Before I could say a word, the ground beneath my feet rumbled and cracked, sending deep fissures through the earth. I stumbled back, panic setting in as the ground erupted in an explosion of dirt and stone. From the newly opened fissures, skeletal hands clawed their way upward, brittle fingers dragging themselves out of the grave. The sight was horrifying, decayed bones moving with unnatural speed, glowing faintly under the pale moonlight. The old man's laugh broke through the chaos, a dry, rasping sound that made my skin crawl. "You shouldn't have come back," he hissed, his voice low but filled with menace. "Now you'll learn the truth, whether you want to or not." Without thinking, I grabbed a large stone from the ground and hurled it at the nearest skeleton. It shattered, sending bones scattering, but more kept rising, clawing their way out of the ground, surrounding me. I swung the stone again, smashing through ribs and skulls, but there were too many. The air smelled of decay and earth. My heart raced as I backed up, trying to find a way out. I caught sight of a rusted shovel lying nearby and grabbed it, swinging it wildly as more undead surged toward me. The shovel hit one of them in the skull, knocking it back, but I could already feel the weight of the fight wearing me down. I needed to do something, to end this. Then, the old man raised both hands, his voice booming out in a language I couldn't understand. The sky darkened further, and a violent gust of wind whipped around me, sending the undead into a frenzy. They rushed toward me like a tidal wave of bones and rotting flesh. With a shout, I plunged the shovel into the earth, the metal scraping against something hard. My hands were slick with sweat as I pulled it free, revealing an ancient, cracked stone. A strange symbol was carved into its surface. I didn't know what it was, but instinctively, I knew it was the key to stopping this nightmare. I gripped the stone tightly, holding it up toward the old man. His eyes widened, a flicker of panic crossing his face. He raised his hands to stop me, but it was too late. I slammed the stone into the ground. The ground shook violently, and a blinding light erupted from the stone, blasting outward in a wave of force. The undead shrieked, their bodies disintegrating in the light. The old man staggered back, his eyes wide with horror, but the light only intensified. With one last scream, the old man collapsed to his knees, his body disintegrating into dust as the light consumed him. The air cleared, and the cemetery fell silent once more. The undead had vanished, and all that remained were the empty graves. I fell to my knees, exhausted, my body trembling from the exertion. My hands were raw from the fight, and my clothes were torn. But I had done it. The nightmare was over. But as I looked around the cemetery, I realized something. The ground where the old man had fallen was now completely barren, the symbol on the stone glowing faintly beneath the moonlight. As I tried to stand, a sharp pain shot through my chest, and I stumbled forward. I looked down to find blood soaking through my shirt. The symbol on the stone had left a mark on me, deep, burning, like it had etched itself into my very soul. The world around me began to blur, the edges of everything fading in and out of focus. I reached out for support, but the ground seemed to shift beneath me, the cemetery warping like a dream I couldn't escape. I looked back at the stone. The symbol still pulsed with energy, but it was slowly fading. It was done. The old man was gone, and the curse was lifted. But at a cost. The pain in my chest intensified, and my legs buckled beneath me. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. The dark sky seemed to press in on me, the weight of the battle taking its toll. My vision darkened as I lay there, unable to move, my breath shallow and ragged. I could hear footsteps approaching, slow and deliberate. A shadow appeared over me, and a figure knelt down beside me. I tried to speak, but my voice faltered. "Who?" I whispered. The figure didn't respond. Instead, they reached down and pressed their hand against my forehead. A strange warmth spread through my body, and for a moment, I felt at peace, as if the pain was fading. The world was right again. But when I opened my eyes, the figure was gone, leaving me alone in the silent cemetery. The moon hung high above, casting long shadows across the graves. When I finally woke up, I wasn't in the cemetery anymore. The pain in my chest had dulled to a faint throb, but the feeling of something lost lingered. I was lying in a bed, the soft sheets wrapped around me like a cocoon. The room was quiet, bathed in soft light. But as I looked around, I realized it wasn't my apartment. The walls were unfamiliar, decorated with strange symbols I didn't recognize. My head was pounding, and every muscle in my body ached as if I had run a marathon. I tried to sit up, but a sharp pain shot through my chest. The wound was still there, though it had been bandaged. Someone had taken care of me. But who? The door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. It was a woman, dressed in dark robes, her face partially obscured by a hood. She looked at me, her expression unreadable. "Who are you?" I croaked. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked toward me, her gaze flicking to the wound on my chest. "You're lucky to be alive," she said finally, her voice low. "But the price you paid." I looked at her, confusion filling my mind. "The price?" She nodded, sitting beside me. "The curse is gone, but so are your memories. You won't remember everything. The old man's death has severed the link, but it's left a hole in your mind. You'll remember fragments, but not the whole picture." My chest tightened, and I felt the weight of her words. The victory that had seemed so sweet now felt hollow. Yes, I had defeated the old man, but the price was more than I could bear. My memories, my life, everything was slipping away. "Is there a way to fix it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She shook her head. "No, the sacrifice is permanent. The world you knew is gone." I stared at her, unable to speak. The realization hit me with crushing force. I had won, but at what cost? My memories were lost, the parts of me that made me who I was, gone. The curse had ended, but I would never be the same again. And as I lay back against the pillow, feeling the weight of the emptiness inside me, I understood. Some victories come with a cost too high to bear. In the end, I was left with only the knowledge that I had saved the world, but I had lost myself in the process.